your superpower can become your weakness. And so there's two things that happen there. You're so busy doing that you just do. And then maybe there's an element of, oh no, I don't need to ask, I can work it out. So that's probably one of the common reasons, identity. The second is control. Yeah. No one cares like I do, or it'll be quicker if I do it. So you're constantly thinking short term, and taking that thinking to each of those one things means that it's a long term trap, because you also teach those around you. That's how you operate. And so they get a learned helplessness as well.
Hey, welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. Today I've got Sachin with me. Hey, Sachin.
Hello.
And today we are talking about owners and practice managers not asking for help. Very common scenario. We're going to cover the problem. The problem here is that you don't get to achieve the outcomes that you want at the speed that you want. And the symptom of this is usually that you've got people that are incredibly self-reliant for a variety of reasons we're going to get into. The outcome we want people to get through to here, Sachin, is about being less key person reliant. Of course, that increases risks, and to get more reliable and faster outcomes that are distributed across the team. Let's talk about the background to this problem. I'm really curious about how this has showed up in your life in ownership and maybe in other areas as well.
Yeah, probably other areas first. So I distinctly remember my cousin that I've spoken about before. He's like my big brother. He died 12 years ago now, but he was incredibly well connected in life, like really well connected. If he needed something, he knew someone who could sort it out. And quite often I'd tell him, I've just bought this thing, or I've just done this thing, and he'd be like, "Why didn't you talk to me?" And a little bit of me was like quite resourceful at just getting, things done myself, not needing anyone else. And a little bit of me was also didn't think to ask, because I was just proceeding without proceed till apprehended almost. And, those were early days, but maybe early days in life, a young adult, etc. Probably cost me a few tens of thousands in different ways, just overpaying for things because he had connections who were working in various places, who could get employee discounts, all sorts of things. So those are the types of things that would happen in the workplace. It's a habit I've struggled to overcome, and still have to fight it, because it's deeply ingrained when you consider yourself smart and resourceful. So it is a constant fight. But in the workplace, it normally means struggling on to get an outcome way beyond a reasonable time frame. So maybe working on something for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and not moving on it. And so that's happened less and less as time's gone on, but without doubt, that's been a common issue. And when I think back to probably like why I've done that, or why I've had those habits, and I think observing many others who may have similar habits, it's one of those situations where your superpower can become your weakness. So you have that identity, I'm smart, I can get things done, I can just roll up my sleeves, do whatever needs to be done. I should be able to solve this. And so there's two things that happen there. You're so busy doing that you just do. And then maybe there's an element of, oh no, I don't need to ask, I can work it out. So that's probably one of the common reasons, identity. The second is control. Yeah. No one cares like I do, or it'll be quicker if I do it. So you're constantly thinking short term, oh, I've just got this one thing, I can just get that done. But there's hundreds of one things, and taking that thinking to each of those one things means that it's a long-term trap, because you also teach those around you. That's how you operate. And so they get a learned helplessness as well. Then there's probably trust, the third one. So you've got identity, control, trust. Maybe you've been burnt by bad advice, or you've heard of others who've been burnt by bad advice. And so you can be a bit skeptical of so-called experts. So it's easier. I can rely on me. In my situation, I'd seen my parents rely on others' advice because they were a bit scared of taking ownership of a situation. And so they could then blame the expert. So I resolved that I'm never going to rely on anyone else. I'm going to rely on me. So it was my superpower, but then has become that weakness that we talked about. So that's number 3. 4 is time, the time illusion, which is a bit like control, which is I'll just figure it out quickly. But the reality is, in that situation, what you thought might be weeks often ends up months or years, and you or there's temporary fixes, not permanent fixes.
In my mind, Sachin, as you're saying this, I'm imagining that person that wanted to self-renovate their house and it's not even half finished after a decade. That kind of vibe where somebody's always like, you know what, I know how to do this, I'll do this myself. But they try and fit it in around the rest of their life, and what happens is nothing. And they end up just living in a place that metaphorically is shit for a long time. And that can often be what your business is like, right? There's a whole bunch of incomplete stuff around you, or even worse, in here, all these open loops of things you should have done.
Oh, absolutely. So that's a classic example, which is one place in life where I've got it right, I reckon. Um, so I've been that person who sort of did their house bit by bit, not renovating because, like you, me and tools don't go together that well. But I remember going to someone's house, an acquaintance, and their house was stunning, immaculate. And I just thought, wow, how do you achieve this? Like, how do you not like the size of the house, but how do you have it decked out, every room sorted, like everything's got its place? And so I did ask this person. Her name was Gita, and I remember asking her. Actually, me and my wife Sneha, we both asked her because we were there. We're like, "How do you get your house so immaculate?" And she said, "Whenever I've moved house, I've allocated a set amount to fully furnish it. And so I have the house purchase price, and then I have my allocated funds for fully furnishing it. And I do that at the beginning. And so when we moved to where we now live, which was our first chance to actually implement that, we engaged an interior designer who historically I would never even have considered that because it wouldn't even have come into my mind to consider that. And I think it was $8,000 for this person, and they designed every room of the house, went through our existing house and went through what furniture we should keep and what we should sell, went through the new house and worked with us on what we should keep and what we should not buy off the vendor, designed the whole house, and then ordered all the furniture we needed for the house, came on one single day and just decked the whole place out. And the whole place, I remember I was meeting you that day in the morning, got back home about 6 p.m., and the whole house, top to bottom, was finished. And that was an example where I did get it right. But that is also an example of the fifth reason why people do DIY, which is you just never would even have thought that someone else would be available to actually help you solve that particular problem or difficulty that you're working on. And I remember early in my ownership days when we had some HR issues, coming across a bespoke HR service that I could just pay, who would take care of my HR fundamentals, just not even knowing that for the previous X years that something like that existed, and the pain and difficulty that that caused is a classic example. So I think those are those five things. I'd say identity, control, trust, time, and not even thinking of it, often because you're too busy.
Yeah, well, let's go into them in a little bit more detail, just so that what I'd really like is that somebody listening or watching this can identify that actually I have some of these traits, that this sounds like me and I need to be aware of this. So let's just go back to the identity a bit. It shows up in owners. I think this also shows up in practice managers. There's a lot of practice managers that I always kind of think in their head they must be a cephalopod. They've got 8 tentacles and they're on top of everything, so they're you mentioned HR earlier. They may have owners those type of owners that say, I'm not quite sure what that person does, where that has multiple layers to it. There's kind of awareness, there's accountabilities. It's a little bit offensive as well and dismissive, but they might be in charge of HR. They might be in charge of leadership. They might be in charge of holding others accountable, possibly in charge of bookkeeping, financial money movement. They may well be in charge of business development, recruitment, training, onboarding, a lot of things. And so often what happens, I think, is some of these owners recruit a personality that's similar to them, where they're kind of very much part of a hustle culture and it's just working within your own knowledge base. Some of those Facebook groups where you have owners and practice managers do my head in a bit, in that you can tell that the question that's been asked is probably 15 seconds of thinking, and then a whole bunch of other people pile in with advice that is really without any sufficient context whatsoever. So let's talk a little bit about the parts of the identity, Sachin. Is there something you think that drives this in particular? Like, how might people be aware that this is a part of their own identity?
So I think, first of all, there's probably some background, which is, someone who's got to where they've got to through hard work, perseverance, grit, determination. So there's probably some background in that. They've had to sort of scale the ladder by really pulling up hard. So that I think that's a big part of it. Some past. The other is they may have had situations where a delegation or handoffs haven't worked, and so it's just like if I want it, if it's to be, it's up to me. That ethos. I think the other part is pride. Maybe you're from a workplace culture or a culture where asking for help is seen as weakness, or second guessing yourself is seen as a weakness. And a lot of this is from our upbringings and our backgrounds for many of us. But it will be that you've seen others, they don't ask for help. So you don't ask for help because you ask for help, then that shows that you don't know everything. And if you don't know everything, then, you know, what else could go wrong? So I think there's some of that. And they're probably the things that stand out for me.
Yeah. Do you think there's elements of the need to know everything, or at least appear to know everything, to kind of be the oracle and to appear to be the smartest person in the room? That some of it is that kind of vibe.
Yeah, so I think there's those 6 human needs that Tony Robbins talks about. There's 4 core needs and 2 of the spirit. And of those 4 core needs, he says, I won't go through them all, but he says that most people are driven by certainty and significance. And so wanting to be right rather than making the right decision is a common symptom. And certainly in my first business partnership with Sati that I've talked about before. We're good friends, by the way. But certainly within myself, I did fight quite often to want to be right when I was a bit less mature in my journey than making the right decision. And sometimes you can fool yourself that it's about making the right decision, but actually, when you peel it back, it's actually about wanting to be right.
Yeah, I think this is part I appreciate of our business relationship. And one of the words that I love with this is rumbling. I think it really illustrates nicely the way that people can toss ideas around in a healthy way. And ultimately, on the other side of a decision, none of us really know how it's going to work out. There's a lot of time. And I remember having a lot of this in my past with what my mum calls right fighting. And she used to say, Todd, you got 2 choices. You can either be right or you can be happy, but you can't be both. And so I think that's part of this. Is it's not about being right. It's just about actually putting forward your best idea, testing it, iterating it, and then coming back and not being too obsessed about who originated the idea, where it came from, who was right and who was wrong. And Lencioni talks a lot about this, but you lose the right to say, hey, you were right on that or you were wrong on that. It's just about these are all just ideas. We're just testing them. And the environment is going to determine whether or not that plays out as something that works or doesn't work at this time.
100% for sure. It's the ability to have, should we say, challenging discussions and debates, and then come to an agreed path forward. And then you may disagree with the path chosen, but having then loyal disagreement behind it, which means that, yeah, you had your say, you're involved in the decision, but a different decision to that which you originally supported has been made, but now everyone gets behind that. That does require a little bit of maturity, both as an individual and as an organization, and it takes time to cultivate that. And if you've not been used to that or even been exposed to that concept, it's very hard initially to bring that into play.
I'd love to just double click on a loyal disagreement. Again, it was one of the Lencioni phrases. It's one of my favorites because I think it's probably not well understood by others. So let's just go through a scenario where you got a PM and an owner that are kind of bashing around ideas on something. The owner is the more dominant player through positional power, and sometimes they might be a little bit more articulate or a bit more convincing in their arguments. And so they've kind of managed to convince the PM to concede ground and agree to their side of the discussion. What does loyal agreement look like on the back of a conversation that may not have been as healthy a conversation as it could be, but there's at least some kind of an agreement at the end of this meeting? What does loyal agreement look like?
Mm-hmm. Um,
Loyal
well,
disagreement, sorry.
well, disagreement. Yeah. So typically in this scenario, what will have happened? There's disloyal disagreement and loyal disagreement, and quite often it actually is disloyal agreement rather than loyal disagreement. So what that means is there's a conversation, someone might feel that they've been railroaded and they'll be saying yes, but every part of their being is actually acting as a no. And so The way that shows up is typically that then other barriers pop up, like the team won't do this, or I've asked this person, but they're not doing it. And so it just feels like a stall. Loyal disagreement, on the other hand, involves being clear on who the decision maker is in a situation. So that's super important. Once that decision maker is clear, then the decision maker should involve, whoever else is involved in contributing to the decision making process. And there are definitely situations in a practice where it's the manager who's actually the decision maker, not the owner. But sometimes that might get pulled from a manager to the owner, like a command and control. I'm the boss, I say what goes. But often that becomes a bit of a pattern. And so in that situation, the manager is disempowered. The owner is just sort of giving edicts that this is what's happening, that's it. And then the manager says yes, but actually has no intention of acting on it. The other version, the loyal disagreement, is where, say, in a leadership team, maybe it's the manager's got the decision and it actually is the manager's decision. Other team members, including the owner, will have their say. Don't need to repeat themselves, don't need to sort of what's called politic, which is fight their point. Just need to make sure, have you understood my viewpoint? And then the manager makes the decision, and all the others who are involved in contributing to that decision agree to support that decision, both in words and actions. And it's never brought up that, I told you so, or I told you this wouldn't work, or there's no sort of raking over the coals again of this is someone's fault, etc. It's just that we all had our say, the decision maker we trusted to make that decision, and now we all get behind it to give it the highest chance of success. So there's two differences there. There's loyal disagreement and disloyal agreement.
And the difference is trust.
Yeah, 100%. So it needs to be a space where you can safely be vulnerable, say your piece. There's actual conflict, but it's just around the situation, and then it's forgotten.
Yeah, and we want a mindful conflict, right? We want disagreement. We don't want everybody. I mean, if everyone in that meeting says, "Yeah, we agree, this is a path of action," I mean, all of them bar one can go home, right? We don't need all those people that are in agreement there.
Yeah, and whoever's the decision maker actually needs to deliberately ask for, if everyone is in consensus, they need to ask for, what are we not seeing here? Who has an alternative viewpoint? Who sees something that we might not be seeing? You need to actually, by mining for it, that's what we mean. Need to go asking for those things, because typically, if we're all agreed on one thing, we have blind spots. But once we've considered those blind spots and actually expanded our perspective, and then if it's consensus, that's cool. But typically, if there's not enough mining for differences of opinion or perspective that's done, and we sort of proceed down the course without challenging it enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Sachin, that's awesome wrap up around the type of behaviors that might underpin the identity for those people who don't like to ask for help. Let's talk a little bit about control. How might it show up in control?
So there'll be one type of control, which is actually just doing it yourself. So not talking about it, not sharing it, just like getting on with it and then handing it off to someone. I've done this, here you go. The other type is micromanagement, which is similar a little bit to what we talked about before about command and control, where you might hand it off, but it's not really handed off because that person actually wants it done exactly how they want it done. But rather than being focused on the outcome, they're focused on the how, which then impedes the creativity and independence and autonomy of the person who's being micromanaged. They're probably the two big ways that it will show up. And then micromanagement has elements of badgering and constant questions, show me this, show me that. Why, asking questions about it, not letting it actually proceed, and actually being a roadblock to whatever is, whatever step or process or initiative that's intended to be implemented, ends up acting as a roadblock to it being successfully rolled out.
Yeah, and there's probably two elements to it as well. Again, coming back to the trust issue, if there's insufficient trust, then people often go back again and again and again and want excess oversight. And the other part of it that is common, but people don't usually reflect on, is really poor delegation skills. So that they're not able to actually delegate something because they can never really describe what the definition of done is. What does the completed thing look like? And I think that's probably a big issue for people in many cases.
Oh, very much so. Often you can have the mindset People have the mindset that, oh, by the time I explain it to someone, I'll just get it done. Or when they do explain it, it's done very superficially because they've been often thinking about it for a long time in their head. And there's a lot of assumed knowledge, which isn't articulated in the delegation. So that often shows up. And then that reduces the chances of success. And therefore, it's easier to step in and DIY. And then so you get into that loop of, well, whenever I ask, it's never done how I want. So I'll just do it myself. So I won't ask. So I'll do it myself. And then it just goes into a bit of a negative spiral.
Yeah, I think the other thing there, Sachin, is it's not normal to be good at describing what's in your head in terms of putting it into useful steps or even the final version. And often you can tell I enjoy my Lego. And so I often think about Lego. You get your book out at the start of the chapter, there's a built version of what you're going to have by the end of the chapter. So there's a literal picture that says, this is what we're doing here. And then it goes through step by step, and each step has micro steps within it. That's getting very much into the house side. But in terms of just being able to draw the picture for the person, I think a Lego manual is a good description as to what you want. Think about anything that's easy to build. IKEA is similar, that they can give sufficient detail that the person that's inexperienced in doing that can have an idea about what the completed product looks like. You need to be able to describe it in as close to those details as you can. If you don't get through the pain, though, of putting together the definition of done, you're never going to be able to delegate projects. And so, unfortunately, those things are going to remain with you no matter how much you want to give them away. If you cannot delegate effectively, they're going to keep bouncing back to you. That's a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a learned skill. Some people are naturally better than others. The more you do it and the more you take feedback on it and see what worked and didn't work, then update the way you go about it, then it's just an improvement cycle. But you can't ever improve something you don't practice. And so it just needs to get better, not just for the owner, but for each person in leadership and then each person in team. Because if it works right, then we should over time be delegating tasks to others and elevating what we do as individuals.
Exactly that. And then furthermore, if you are early on in the delegation journey, you find that you're not great at this, then one thing that I've found useful is just to say to whoever it is that you've delegated to, if you ever need extra context, then I'm available for a 10-minute appointment where you can interview me and you can give me a briefing beforehand as to what context you need, just so that you can be interviewed. But it's really important that you're using only your brain and not your hands. So the other person is the only one using their hands. It's only an interview for them to get a little bit more color and context on exactly what's going on and where they're intending to get to. And then over time, you'll just get better at giving the brief that doesn't require further context. But if you just give permission for people to have a 10 to 20-minute interview just to get further context, then at least you can move the project forward without actually using your own hands.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good technique.
All right, I think we've covered trust pretty well in those first two. Was there anything else you wanted to add with trust? We've done identity, control. In the trust layer itself, what do you think is important that people kind of understand about trust?
Trust again is built, so it doesn't just happen like, oh, trust me. It's not words. It needs to be built when it's within the team. So when we're talking about DIY, there's DIY in the team. There's also DIY with getting external help. When it's internal, then it needs to be built and cultivated. And so typically it's built on the foundation of people being able to be vulnerable, be their true selves and not hide anything. And so often as the leaders, we have to be vulnerable and role model that. As we role model it, it shows to others that it's safe to be vulnerable. And then when someone is vulnerable, we've got to acknowledge it, appreciate it, and not push back against it, because otherwise it stops being safe. And if it's not safe, there's no trust. And so I think internally, trust has to be built on the foundation of sort of the safety of being able to be vulnerable. And then when we're thinking about external sort of services and external parties that you may work with to get help or assistance, then I think trust is often in evidence. What have they done? What's their track record? What's their past show to us? And then there's also trusting yourself. If you are using an external helper of some sort, trusting yourself to invest in that, because it normally would involve an investment. trusting and having faith in yourself and your team, that you trust them with those resources, those external resources. And I think track record and evidence of what those helpers have achieved, and actually looking for that outside. It's easy for people to say that they can achieve something or do something. We've spoken before about people who have been quoted, astronomical sums for something that's very, very simple, really, and sometimes given erroneous advice. We've talked about that before, and it does happen. And so you can see the character of the people and who you go to help for. There's plenty of knowledge and information and content out there. So it's important to look for consistency in that. So that's probably the way I would think about trust internally and trust externally.
Yeah. I think one other thing as a leader, Sachin, that I believe is super important in trust is consistency. So this is a bit underappreciated. And I think it shows up in two ways. In business leadership in particular, it's not okay to be emotionally labile and inconsistent in the way that you show up, either in your appearance or your way that you communicate with others. It's really important not to lose your shit, which is not the same as being vulnerable. So being vulnerable is completely okay. And as you rightly point out, the vulnerability of the team will never exceed the vulnerability of the leader. You do need to be comfortable saying, hey, I'm really not quite sure what the right next move is. Things like that, or apologizing for when you've perhaps not led in the way that you could have. But anger and outbursts, and particularly public interactions that are embarrassing or shameful to other people, are really, really damaging of trust. Consistency. I remember showing up on days when I'll be honest, I really didn't want to be there, or I thought that the business could fail at any time, and being outwardly positive and leading in the way that you would hope to be led. But some days that's really hard to do. You just think, man, there's like 50 other things I would prefer to do rather than go and do that thing. It's a little bit like when you've got gym scheduled for the afternoon, it's a bit rainy, it's warm in the house, there's stuff to do. You're like, maybe I don't really want to go and do that thing. But there's the part of you that's like, I made a commitment to this. I made a commitment to myself. I made a commitment to other people. And I think that consistency of just showing up in the way that is your identity. So it does need to be a part of who you are, but it's super important. And it's really, really critical to iron out any impetuous behaviors, any emotionally labile episodes that you have, because you're just going to be judged on your worst behavior, not your best. That's unfortunately the way that works. And I think that's one of the underrated things in trust. I know, Sachin, you've talked about some things that actually help build trust that you've shared in the past. So walk me through in the morning and at the end of the day, your routine as an owner. You get into the practice and you leave the practice. Just walk me through some of that, because I want people to take away what are some actions that I could instill right now that will help me build trust with the people around me. So you walk in the clinic, are you the first person there turning the lights on and things, or is somebody else there?
Uh, not always, but yeah, in the early days I was, but generally similar time to the first admin person, sometimes a bit earlier. Typically, there'd be a good morning and hello to each and every person, and time to do that. Then there's the employees and the non-employees, which is mainly the GPs. And so my routine was the good morning, the hello, the walk around, and then once a week I would have a doorway conversation with every GP. It's typically it's leaning against their door. They didn't shut it in my face, thankfully, so it was good.
Put your foot in there first.
Yeah, not
Salesperson
wasn't
style.
blocking it. Yeah, and there'd be the occasional hug, and then the other one was a shared mealtime. I think there's a Harvard Business Review article on that as well, which it's a key determinant apparently of improved culture is shared meal times. Some practices have morning break together, lunch together, and an afternoon break together, or scheduled at least. But a shared time most days of the week where most people could be there was really useful, especially for the clinicians, just a debrief period. Oh, this thing happened this morning, and what do you think about that? It just means nothing's festering, because as they're in their own room, it can be a bit more heavy when you have clinical concerns in particular that are on your mind. So those were some of the things. There's probably two key, one skill and one mindset that I think is helpful. The mindset is you're sort of playing poker, in that people will bring you stuff Bit like when you're, as a doctor, people will bring you stuff that you're like, "What?" You know, inside you're like, "Okay." But externally, you just have to be able to give an air of almost nonchalance. It's not a nonchalance though, you'll empathize and care, but you just can't show too much reactivity, yeah. Because along the journey, there will be people who may try and push buttons, etc., which can lead to some toxicity in the business. So that's one mindset, I think, of the poker player, non-reactive. But the other is the tactical pause, which is that when someone brings you something, there's no compulsion on you to solve it in that moment. All right. And so the best thing to do is a few rounds of and what else, and what else. And then it's completely okay to say, I need to just go and think about this and consider all the things you've shared with me. I appreciate it that you've shared that. And I'm going to come back to you in XYZ. And that just gives you time to, instead of it being reactive, allows you to be responsive and just take some time to think and consider the situation before you respond. And that solves some of the stuff you were talking about, reactiveness and anger and temperament. If you struggle with temperamental or managing temperament, which, all of us are individuals, that will be there for some, use the tactical pause. Even if you don't struggle, use the tactical pause. Like, just think of that first time someone's coming to you as just your opportunity to let them get everything out. You don't have to reply other than thanking them, acknowledging it, and setting a time frame for when you're going to come back to them. If you can do that, that just buys you time to keep more of an even temperament so you can make a better response.
I love it. So I think we've covered well identity, control, trust. I'd love to spend a little bit of time on the time illusion. What happens here, Sachin, that people get sucked into thinking that this is a good use of their time?
Yeah, so I think that can be linked to the control part as well, especially if your skill at delegating hasn't developed much yet, then it can feel like it's a waste of time. And so often there's the thought of, rather than explaining it to someone else, I know how to do it, I can just get it done. And so we'll think, often it will be a case of, okay, well, it'll only take 2 hours, I'll get it done. But the problem is, normally we're not just sitting around waiting for more things to do. We normally have a long laundry list of things to do in ownership. And so what's easy to forget is that when I take on this new thing, which isn't actually my job, but I'm taking it on because it's quicker that I'll do it, something else has to make way for that. And if you do that with 10 different things, then there's probably 10 other things that have to make way for that. And the likelihood is, if it's a regular recurring thing, which most things will be, is that it will just break further down the track and you'll be more frustrated because you thought you'd fixed it, but you hadn't. You just did it once and then hoped it would keep happening. And so the reality is that what might seem like just a little bit of time to fix actually ends up taking months or years because it keeps breaking, and then you have to keep fixing until you can get a system in place where people can actually replicate and do it on a regular cadence, whatever that thing is. The problem there is that if they're not involved in creating the solution, they're then driving someone else's solution, which often they won't understand.
I think this is exactly the point, right? So that if the mindset is anything you lean into to fix or lend your skills to, the odds are that you actually still own that process or that system, because when it breaks or it doesn't function as intended, it's going to bump back to you because those were your contributions. So I think that's worth thinking about. Anytime you lean in to fix something, you are now part of the solution and part of the future problems.
100%. And we're quite creative, right? So we can often MacGyver a solution to a problem, but generally we may not be good ongoing process people. So even though you can solve it for now and have something working, that's different to an ongoing process. And that's why, if we can democratize that and delegate it to appropriately resourced and qualified colleagues, and then we give them the chance to make it better and the chance to have our input if and when they need it, like you talked about earlier, then that's much more likely to stand the test of time and save wasted time and effort.
Yeah. The other thing that is important to appreciate here too, Sachin, is something that you failed to delegate. It's a growth opportunity you denied someone in your team. You're not going to find out what people can do unless you actually give them projects to work on. And so if we do want to find out the capacity and the capabilities of our team, we just got to give them a job. I love this in kids basketball. So in coaching teams, I love it when you give kids a really clear job. So one of the teams I coach, we're a pretty short team, and there's a couple of kids who usually play the low post when we're defending, and so that means their job is to keep the big kids out. And generally speaking, that's a tough job. But when you say to one of these kids, all right, I won't use their names because I don't have the permission to use it, but I say, hey, I need you to do this one job. Your job is to make sure that that player does not get inside the paint and shoot anything from within the key. Have you got it? They're like, yep, got it. And these kids, like, they will just go out there. They've got a really clear objective. And so they can tell if they succeeded or failed. And I think that that's really cool in that they are put into it. They really love the idea. Whereas if you just said, oh, the team's accountable, then no one's really accountable. So it would be quite easy to say, okay, well, all of our job is to prevent that player getting to there. You're like, no, actually, that belongs to this one person. And if they're having trouble, they'll ask for help. And that's when your job is to go and help out at that time. That's a really simple example, but I think it just illustrates that having a clear objective and delegating that to people and then seeing if they rise to the occasion. At the end of the game, when those kids have achieved those objectives, the smiles are massive. You go around, punch out some high fives and give a shout out to the good work that's been done. You just find out what people are made of. And I think that most people like finding out what they're made of as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's once you've got real clarity over what success looks like, then it's much easier to actually go and achieve it.
Awesome. So we arrive at awareness of solutions. Now, I think the challenge is with those first four layers: identity, control, trust, and the time illusion. By definition, you're kind of looking down. You're not looking up, and so therefore you won't tend to have an awareness of solutions. How do we address this layer, Sachin, where people have a default setting, which is if it's to be, it's up to me? And just a reminder that in our four layers of practice ownership, the nightmare job layer to flip into the well-paid job layer, the line that has to be crossed is the fear and ignorance line. And the false belief is if it's to be, it's up to me. It's DIY everything. And then in order to get to the next layer, you have to acknowledge that you're the bottleneck. So that's a really important appreciation you have to have as an owner, that you are committing to not being the bottleneck. How do we improve our awareness of solutions, Sachin?
I think there's a simple question that can be asked when deciding on solving the problem, which is, instead of focusing on the how aspect, focusing on, who can I turn to for help with this? And when we think of asking ourselves who, there's who in my team and who in terms of an external support or resource. And so asking that one question and pausing to ask that as part of the process of decision making, that's probably the key starting point. Then the question arises around, especially the external aspect, is where do I ask for that help? Where do I find out who else can help me aside from the resources in my existing team? And then there's probably three places to look at. There are sort of peer groups. So you may have other owners that you're part of. There's the varying quality, some of the online spaces. So you have to be very careful there, because as you talked about earlier, the quality of the brief will determine the types of answers you get. Even when you have a high quality brief, you don't know the experience behind the answers that are given. It's often experience of a limited set of circumstances and situations. And so it will be potentially quite biased, but that's definitely one place, peer groups online or in person. There are consultants, experts who you pay to come and help solve a particular thing. Again, there can be quite a big variance in experience and knowledge amongst those groups, and often again colored by individual experiences. Then there's coaching. So there's coaching and content. So there are generic services or business coaches. I often talk about Nick the Coach, who was a general business coach that when I started receiving coaching, that's where we started in our practice. And then there's specialized coaching like we do it in Scama Clinic and Project X, which isn't coaching alone, right? So there's content, which is how to do the thing that you're trying to do. There's coaching, which is I'm stuck with this thing. Can you help me get unstuck? And then there's community, which is normally lived experiences of people having done similar or the very same thing in a whole variety of contexts. So then the experience and the inputs that you get are way beyond just one other person in one other setting. You're talking about tens or hundreds of other experiences, which you can then use in combination with the content or instructions of how to do something, the coaching of when you're stuck, plus the ability to modify things to your setting. So those are probably the types of places you can go, but it all starts with asking a question, who else can help me with this? And it might not even be a question. It might be a direction to self. We're doing this thing. I'm not doing any of it. So who is doing it? And then you have who internal and who external. And then you just think through who that who is. That is definitely, it just can't be you as the owner.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one question I often like to ask myself with this, Sachin, is do I think someone has solved this already? That's just my internal question. And the answer to almost everything is, yeah, I suspect they have. And then it's easy to go looking for who has done that. I have two rules for who I choose to do this. My first rule is, has this person actually done it? I think that's pretty rare. Sometimes people are advising on things that they haven't done. And so this is literal advisory firms are this, which always stuns me that these businesses make so much money and helping governments to deliver things that they are never accountable for is just an ideas factory. So the first thing I would like to know is, has this person done this thing? And then the second thing for me is, have they helped other people achieve the outcome I want as well? And so this is like if I was climbing Everest and I want to get to the top and back, remembering, of course, that every dead body on Everest was once a highly motivated individual. I would like to remain a highly motivated individual. And so I'm going to look for a guide that has been there themselves and has taken many, many other trips. And if somebody's done it 20 times rather than 2 times, then to me, that's the person that I want. Somebody who's led others more often just means that they are more likely to be able to achieve success in the future. That's my kind of evaluation of the services that I like to engage, because I just think I want the most highly likely outcome. So I'm clear on what I want, and I want to have the highest probability that I get from where I am now to where I'd like to be, and using that person, whether it's a done for you, done with you service, it doesn't matter that much. I really want to look at the likelihoods. I'm actually stunned by the number of people that advise on things they've never done. It might be valuable to have the input of somebody with admin experience or employee experience, but that's absolutely nothing like an owner experience. It's a very different thing having your capital, your backside, everything on the line compared to an employee mindset or somebody that has non-sectoral experience, coming from other parts of the health system. I think it is important that you've actually done the things that you're advising on. That's usually how my brain works in solving this problem.
Yeah, I think that's wise words, and it makes complete sense that it's all a game of when you're essentially making a bet when you decide to do something, and you want to stack the odds in your favor, and those odds happen to increase or reduce, sorry, when you have experience and proof of someone having done it repeated times.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. That's been a super useful episode. So we've worked through identity, control, trust, time illusion, and awareness of solutions when it comes to not asking for help. For all of you hyper independent people, DIYers out there, you should now be able to diagnose the problem and have an awareness of the solution, but get to doing it. Don't do the same behaviors. I've been Todd. Thank you, Sachin. We'll see you on the next Scale My Clinic podcast. Bye.
Thank you.